How much memory does Borderlands 4 require? And I'm not talking about system memory, although we could look into that a bit. I'm talking about graphics card memory, VRAM. We can answer roughly how much it will use. We can't say for sure how much it needs. But I can tell you anecdotally that 8GB cards really start to struggle at anything above medium settings, even at 1080p. And we will see why by examining some cards with more memory. At the top, I've got the NVIDIA GeForce RTX 5090, and then the step down switching to AMD, I'm using their top card, the Radeon RX 9070 XT. And we'll go through each card in turn. We'll start with the 5090. I've got 6 settings that I've tested. Native at 1080p, 1440p, and 4K. Then I have DLSS quality mode at 4K, performance mode DLSS at 4K, and then finally, DLSS performance mode with MFG 4X frame generation. That's multi-frame generation, so it generates 3 frames for every 1 rendered frame. This is just looking at memory use, not at performance. I've got separate videos on performance. So let's start with the low preset. Minimum VRAM use for 1080p native was 7.2 gigabytes on the 5090. That increases to 8.1 at 1440p, 9.8 at 4K. So immediately you can see 8 gig cards could definitely start to struggle there. Turning on DLSS doesn't actually reduce the VRAM requirements that much. Quality mode's 9.3 gigabytes, performance mode 9 gigabytes, but if you turn on MFG, then that bumps it back up to 9.5 gigabytes. What about on the AMD side? Now, interestingly, most of these numbers are slightly higher than what we saw with the 5090. So this card has 16 gig of physical VRAM. The 5090 has 32 gigabytes. So we know basically that the game is not going to use more than what the 5090 shows. But the 9070 XT shows how much the game might use on a 16 gig card. Of course, it's AMD instead of NVIDIA. There's going to be differences in drivers. That's not the major point here. Again, starting with low though. We start at 7.6 gigabytes at 1080p native. That bumps to 8.5 at 1440p. So again, 8 gig cards could start to struggle a little bit. 10.1 at 4K native, dropping to quality mode FSR4 upscaling, reduces that to 9.7 gigabytes. Performance mode upscaling is 9.2 gigabytes. And performance mode upscaling with frame generation is back to 9.7 gigabytes. How about at medium settings? Immediately, even 1080p native has moved beyond 8 gigabytes of VRAM allocated. It might not need all of that, but games like to leave some memory available for other uses, so they usually start to have issues if you go above about 90% VRAM use, 95% for sure. So 8.3 indicates that 8 gig cards could actually stutter more than cards with, say, 10 gig. 9.3 gig at 1440p, and then 11 gigabytes at 4K native. You really are going to need more than 8 gig to run Borderlands 4 comfortably on an NVIDIA card. That's my thought. That's what this seems to indicate. And I've done a little bit of testing with the RTX 5050 and noticed that, yeah, even with upscaling and frame generation, you start to run into VRAM issues. Medium is usually okay, but high settings and above, definitely a problem. MFG 4X with DLSS performance mode at 4K, 10.7 gigabytes. Not a whole lot less than native 4K when you turn on upscaling and multi-frame generation. How about on the AMD side? Again, a little bit more in a lot of instances than what we saw with the NVIDIA GPU. 8.9 gigabytes, bare minimum at 1080p native, and that increases to 11.7 gigabytes for 4K native, with FSR upscaling reducing the memory requirements a bit, and then frame generation bumping them back up a little bit. So you can see the difference between the FSR4P and the FSR4P FG is about 0.8 gigabytes, 800 megabytes of VRAM, and things only get worse once we go to high settings. For the 5090, we're now up to 9.3 gigabytes at a minimum, extending up to 12.6 gigabytes for 4K native, and then upscaling with MFG4X is at 12.1 gigabytes, which means even a card like the 5070 might have issues with VRAM at high settings, and it will use more at very high and badass, which we'll get to in a moment. On the AMD side, 10 gigabytes at a minimum, up to 13.3 gigabytes for 4K native. And again, FSR reduces memory use a bit. we're down to 12.5 gigabytes for performance mode upscaling, which is 1080p native rendering plus upscaling, and then frame generation. So even just upscaling, we're seeing almost 2 gigabytes of extra VRAM use relative to 1080p native. That's kind of interesting. And then 600 meg more to go from performance upscaling to frame generation. The very high preset and the badass preset really look super similar as far as I can tell, but there are probably nuances and differences and such. But now we're up to nearly 10 gig used on 1080p native and 14 gig for 4K native. Definitely going to run into issues with 12 gig cards at 4K native for NVIDIA. DLSS helps, of course, reduces the memory requirements and use. This is the maximum I saw in like a 1.5 minute video clip, incidentally. So sometimes it's a little bit less than this. It didn't go more than this, at least not that I noticed. But I will say most of the time the VRAM use was relatively consistent. So when it says 11.9, it's not like it spiked to 11.9, but was usually at 10. It's more like, hey, I saw a range of 11.3, 11.4 up to 11.9. You will see some spikes that I didn't include every now and then. Like if it jumped 800 meg at one point and that only lasted a second before garbage collection kicked in, I didn't factor those in. Still, 12 gig cards with DLSS performance mode and MFG4X, they're maybe going to struggle a bit at very high settings. On the AMD side, 10.7 gig at a minimum up to nearly 15 gig at the top. So this is a 16 gig card and we're using 14.9. It might even be doing garbage collection to keep under the maximum that the game engine wants to use. And Unreal Engine 5 will do that. Like it says, hey, I'm running out of VRAM. Let's clear some stuff that hasn't been used in a bit out of VRAM. But it can use up to 15 gig is what this shows. Will it always need that? That's a little bit more difficult to say. 8 gig cards, though, most certainly will see struggles and problems. And finally, we have the badass setting because it's so awesome and edgy, whatever. 10.9 gigabytes, 11.8, 12.0, going up the ladder. Going from 1080p native to DLSS performance mode, which is 1080p upscaled to 4K, used 1.1 gigabytes. If you're at quality DLSS at 4K, that's actually rendering at 1440p and upscaling, which is apparently only needing about 900 megabytes extra. MFG4X seems to then use about 1.2 gigabytes more than just upscaling. And of course, native at 15.2 gigabytes, that says you pretty much need either the 5060 Ti 16 gig, obviously prior generation 4060 Ti 16 gig would also qualify, just to hold all the textures and map data and such in memory. That doesn't mean you would get good performance at 4K native. That's a different story. 5090 obviously is built to run 4K maxed out settings. But everything below that, you might need to turn down settings a notch, tweak things in order to get better performance. Of course, DLSS and MFG4X are good ways to do that. And on the AMD side, 11.6 gig at a minimum, up to 15.3 at a maximum. Frame generation with performance mode upscaling ties quality mode upscaling alone. Uses 800 meg more than the 1440p native. And the performance mode used 1.4 gigabytes more than 1080p native. That's the rundown. Will the game run on cards with 8 gig? Yes. Will it run well at high to very high to badass settings? Generally speaking, no. The answer is no. Doesn't matter how fast your GPU is. Whether you're running like a 2080 Super, definitely going to struggle. If you're running a newer card that has 8 gig like a 3070 Ti, it's going to struggle. Be aware of these limitations and plan accordingly. System memory use, incidentally, I have 32 gig and I never saw memory use go above 21. That doesn't mean it needs 21. I saw like higher settings often used less system memory because it would put things into VRAM instead of DRAM. So anywhere from about 15, 16 gig up to 21, 22 gig of system memory use, which means pretty much you want 32 gig. 16 gig probably will work okay at lower settings, but be wary at higher settings. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe and let me know what else you'd like to see me test. Do you like Borderlands 4 or do you think it's overrated? Sound off in the comments and we will see you next time.